There's a huge danger here. One is to say, oh, we're going to look at this at a broad meta level and forget that a person died. The other one is to just focus on, well, this is a person who died. That's Memphis. That's not where I live. That's over there. And there are two extremes there that we don't want to get stuck in.
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Well, this is your warning that this is going to be a heavy episode. The title will have given it away. And also, this is basically what everybody is talking about right now. But we did want to talk about Tyre Nichols, the murder that took place in Memphis. And we hope that we can do some helpful processing here. It's worth pointing out, of course, that as of this recording, this is January 30th, the details are still limited. And this is an ongoing story. It's unfolding daily. No doubt by the time this is aired and you're listening to it, way more details will be available. And of course, more will be available in the oncoming weeks. So we're certainly not prophets, and we're not here to make definitive pronouncements on every aspect of this case. But we did want to process through it also just from a Christian standpoint. What do we do with a story like this? It's obviously very distressing on a number of different levels. And Nathan, one of the things I immediately was thinking of was what the international response will be. You know, how does somebody say who's in France or Australia, you already hear so many stories about how violent of a nation America is, and we are a very violent nation, it's true. But when you hear a story about 5 police officers brutally beating a person to death whom they've pulled over, just the picture that emerges is a pretty chaotic one. So I've just been sort of thinking on that and praying through this. I mean, I know that it's a cultural moment that I think we can just acknowledge this. This is more of just a general feel in the air.
Hang on a second.
But it's a cultural moment that Yeah, let's hear it.
Is violence in America a cultural moment? Say more about that, because I think from Wild West to homicide rates in Chicago to the history of that. I mean, it's so in some ways
that's not where I was going.
Yeah. So clarify there for a second. Bring us along on what you think is unique about this part of this moment.
Yeah. Oh no, I would say violence is a consistent thread running through America. So that doesn't feel new to me. No, what I was getting at, and this does crop up from time to time in different eras, this feeling, but it's a feeling of chaos. That's really, and that sounds like a very dramatic word. And generally speaking, on Thinking Out Loud, we will avoid dramatic terms, but I can't come up with a better one. These times feel chaotic. There's a sense of crumbling order. There's a sense of just a pent up kind of aggression that you're seeing more and more of. And this incident just seems to be offers a very vivid picture of that. Now, I don't want to speak in broad abstract terms though either, because we're dealing with a human life that's been lost, senselessly lost. And so I think part of the way I want my posture here to remain focused on the person who's been lost here and all that he meant to his children, his friends, his family, but also just to acknowledge that I think it seems to be of a piece with a general mood that seems very chaotic. No, I don't think violence is a new thing here at all. In fact, I think America is a uniquely violent nation and always has been.
Well, I'll just lump us in with humanity there. So I think that's the more unsettling thing, is you said this is a vivid example of something. The amount of abuse and destruction and the evil generated by the human heart is phenomenally high, and that is not unique to Americans. Now, we have tools to express that in ways that other countries don't have access to, and there are good and bad reasons for that. But I think that should be one of the we would like to think. So this is where we kind of have to walk a line here of yes, there's an individual involved here. And let's say that he was up to totally shady stuff and everything is regrettable about the entire situation. But we remember the biblical injunction here that the Lord does not delight in the death of the wicked. So even if he was, I don't know, imagine what you think would justify it, there's still no delight in it. And I'm not making that as an accusation. I'm just saying, even if you ran it to its logical extreme, from the Lord's perspective, the death of anybody is a sad and tragic thing. So that takes all of the moral posturing and guesswork out of it, of thinking about whether or not this is bad or whether or not it's sad. It is, regardless of the details leading up to it. It's sad. So we sit in that and yeah, Cameron.
Yeah, well, Nathan, I think why don't you, if you're up for it, bring in some of those specific details because you've done a pretty close kind of tracking and analysis of what some of what transpired before,
Well,
as the actual stop took place.
yeah. So
And I
you've
know.
read you've read the transcript. I watched all the footage, and it's also interesting to watch read how different people see different things in the footage of it all breaking down. And I have significant questions about things that I think will um, have to be answered. But so there's nothing that goes right in the entire thing. And lots of people are going to say, look, you didn't comply with 71 commands. You could have easily prevented your death here by just simply doing what they were asking you to do from the get go. And that's possibly to probably true. On the other hand, there's a whole lot else going on there that I don't know the background of. And it seems like there has to be more that was happening before the video kicks on than because the cops are pretty hot by the time they get him out of the car in the first place. And then there's the first confrontation and the whole wrestling around and trying to get him on his stomach with his hands behind his back, and that doesn't work. And then tasing, and then him running, and then the chase and all of that. And then it's in the second time they catch him where things get really, yeah, you
Escalate
would, yeah,
majorly. Yeah.
you don't want to watch that. I mean, so you basically have, somebody on the ground getting kicked in the face, and then with their arms held behind their back, getting punched in the face. Um, Enough so that, I mean, like you said, Cameron, to the degree that you would die from it is a significant beating. So
Mhm.
there's nothing justifiable about anybody's behavior toward the end of that in any circumstance. So don't hear me saying that. But it comes back. I want to, while you're talking about chaos,
Mhm.
that's exactly what you're watching happen there. And the reason that some of this becomes interesting to us is that there are two forms of, I almost need like a capital C chaos and a little c chaos here, in the sense that the biblical story starts off with chaos, and then order is brought out of chaos, and there's a story that goes around chaos. Like it's like we can make sense of it. So we see like this chaotic thing is happening, and here's why. And something about putting a boundary and a why around the chaos gives us peace. But then other times you look at something like this and you don't know the why. You don't know the story. You just
Mhm.
see the chaos, and there's this national and personal fidgetiness of like, what is going on here and what are we seeing? We don't know the backstory. We don't know all the motives. We don't know the amount of unknown that goes around
Yeah.
this little vivid snapshot into it is what terrifies everybody. Um, and this one uniquely lacks some of the um, and the degree to which we want to talk about race, we can. I mean, so if there had been different races involved here, we'd be having a very different conversation. This is why this one uniquely might highlight some things that are part of um, chaos and violence and evil and a lot of other things. Like we can't just totally set race aside, but on this one, it allows us to look past that to see something more indicative about humanity than some of the other interactions have in the past. So that doesn't exactly answer your question. I'm just saying that's why it's hard to grapple with, and part of the uneasiness that we have because we want to know why, and we just can't or won't yet have a good way of dealing with that.
Yeah, and that clear rage that punctuates this whole spectacle is one of those disconcerting factors for me because I do think of if these police officers are this angry to begin with, and of course all manner of speculation takes place on why that is the case, what were there any events preceding this, we don't know right now, but certainly you have that lack of control on display at the beginning. I mean, this man is clearly, yeah, so is he not cooperating at the beginning? No. But is it likely that he's afraid and terrified? I mean, I think so.
Mm.
I'd agree. And also, I mean, there's a long legacy and just a problem for particularly for black people, brown skinned people in getting pulled over. There's already so much tension, so much anxiety, so much fear there. This man gets pulled over and immediately there's this very aggressive tone and an atmosphere. The fact that it escalated, I think, is to the degree that it did is horrifying, but there's to a certain extent it's not that surprising. And of course, these five guys who are supposed to be maintaining order, minimizing violence, and basically ensuring public safety in this particular instance are doing, I mean, really are doing the opposite of that. And so and of course, we can, it's worth pointing out as well. We're seeing a lot of, I mean, this story will of course bring massive scrutiny on not just the Memphis Police Department, of course, but police officers around the country.
Hmm.
And Nathan, we talked a little bit about this. When anytime you put on a uniform, whether you're a police officer, a firefighter, or a soldier, you're you're an ambassador, of course, for an institution. So something like this happens, it just casts the shadow over the whole thing. And I mean, of course, Memphis now, I mean, this whole city is going to be under so much scrutiny. There's going to be a kind of, institutional surgery that takes place now on this place, and likely we'll have more revelations and more stuff is going to be brought to light. But I think
What?
it's worth bringing that in here too.
Yeah. So the thing of it is what that everybody involved in it would, in hindsight, have a justifiable reason for what they did. Perhaps, or in their mind, have a reason for, so the cops may very well have thought this guy is a danger. And what we're supposed to do with dangerous people is subdue them and arrest them and prevent more reckless. Like we don't know. Now, it could be that they just went nuts. They were on drugs as part of an internal gang. Who knows? But we can't speculate on that from here, and we can't speculate on what was going on in his mind as well. But I want to get to your point on the representation thing because I just looked it up. 50,000 people a day get pulled over by the cops in the United States. So 50,000 is a lot. And this one from several days ago is the one that is going to make the news and stay on the news for a long time. So you have 49,999 versions of this that didn't end like that. So I'm very certain that every police officer who's involved in every single one of those other ones does not want to be associated or identified with, nor should we assume, that type of action. Then, so it's complicated in that way. So I just wanted to highlight the point that you're making there of the idea of collective representation, or how you're judged based off of individuals who look the same as you, is a serious thing,
It
or
is
wear the same
deep, yeah,
uniform.
and well, and of course, and the other another analogy we can bring in here is for those of us who call ourselves Christians. We numerous misrepresentations happen on a public level, and major scandals happen on a public level, and then it's just one of those byproducts of something like that you're going to be associated with it. And there is, but I also want to say this, and this is going to push a few buttons, and feel free to push back on me, Nathan, here. But again, this is thinking out loud. But I've said before, I said this in the book I wrote called Faith That Lasts with my dad. Whenever I hear, so I've made quite a few statements about this being a chaotic cultural moment. There's another phrase I heard a lot, and Nathan, I've talked to you about this, complained about this, that we're you're the level of moral insanity that we're seeing in our nation. I hear this a lot from Christians. Okay, I'm picking on Christians now. I had a problem with that phrase, and even me saying chaotic culture. So I got to qualify this here. If we're talking about a culture that's in precipitous decline, just from a cultural standpoint, we are most certainly numbered in that decline. So we are part of it. So when there is an egregious, say, moral failing in the church, in Christianity, especially if it's sort of in our circles, evangelical circles, and we're associated with it, I think there's some share of ownership. I mean, it's that maybe is necessary. It's worth searching our hearts. This isn't comfortable for us because this actually hones in on, I would say, a little more of a biblical view of sin, which views sin not as a purely individual thing. It can't be a purely individual thing. If you're a human being, you're a relational creature. Now there is a balance here, because we have to. Scripture also says, work out your own salvation in fear and trembling. But if we are inescapably relational creatures, and we are part of a community, and in our community we see this kind of heinous behavior, then I think there is room for soul searching. There is room for searching our hearts, and there's room for taking our share of ownership in the matter. How have I, in my small, maybe imperceptible ways, contributed a little bit to the culture that makes something like this more possible? That's a challenging point to make, and I'm totally ready for some pushback. We can go back and forth on that, but I think it's worth stating that here a little bit, because we're dealing with that kind of a story here.
All right. So Nathan slides his chair forward. Let's wallow in this a little bit.
Lowers the glasses on the nose.
And we appreciate your graciousness as you listen to this with us, because we are really thinking out loud here and trying to, and we'll probably say things.
Extraordinarily difficult case, and very, emotions will run very high on it. So we're trying to tread as carefully as we can, but also be honest and process through this.
Let's see. We'll see where we go. Okay, so two things. Let's complicate this. Let's say that it turns out that one of these guys is a member of the church of your same denomination. Memphis, chances that somebody's involved or connected to a church, I don't know.
Sure.
So we can talk about put on the uniform and identify the same way. Okay, well, let's think about if there's a religious connection there as well. So that's just a whole rabbit trail we don't need to go down, but I'm throwing that out there. The other thing is, and so in Wendell Berry's book, The Need to Be Whole, he has an entire chapter on sin. And he said that essentially he talks a lot about public sin, which basically from one side of the aisle is if you haven't had an abortion, you're okay. And if you're not publicly racist on the other side, you're okay. So those are the two sins. And as long as you don't commit either of those, you're good to go. It's super easy to be good now online. You just have to not do two things and you're fine. And he said this is a total upending of the entire human experience, and a recognition that sin operates on scales and continuums through our hearts in every direction. And there are levels of this that are endemic to humanity, that they're communal and collective sins that we all deal with and wrestle to some degree. And so you might say, I'm not an angry person and I would never do that. You probably also haven't been in a 13-minute fight where you've been pepper sprayed in the face recently. And so what you can see in these types of interactions are extreme versions of things that are alive in every human heart. Let me say that again, because that is a provocative claim, and I understand that.
Say it again.
But what you see when you see chaos on this degree break loose is the extreme end of a continuum of something that you're actually capable of as well. Mm-hmm. Now, that is not justifying it, and it's not saying it's good, but it also has a deep degree of Jesus saying, get the plank out of your own eye kind of thing going on here. So I'm not excusing any behavior, but on the other hand, I'm pointed to Cameron's thing of saying that there is a degree to which we're implicated in some of the things that we've seen there, because that which we point to out there, the seeds of it are alive and well in us if we aren't rightly ordered in our relationship with the Lord and with truth and reality. So, to that degree, that is true and that is there. And it's wild then that we need a incident this severe in order to make us think about that,
Mhm.
because there isn't a so I don't know, look at your local theater, what movies are being played, and show, and I would guarantee you that in what, half of them somebody's going to get beaten to death. I mean, so look at what we use for entertainment as
Mhm.
part of our cultural ethos, and we put it under the category of entertainment, and then let's be surprised that there are actually violent people in the world. I'm not saying that the violence replicates what we see in film and entertainment. I'm saying that the film and entertainment seems realistic to us because it replicates reality. And so if stuff like this doesn't cause you to delve into the brokenness of the condition of humanity and start to think that maybe we need a savior outside of police reform, or government oversight or whatever, I don't know what will. And I'm not saying that there aren't things that we can do to structurally improve things, and there are wise and level headed things that could be done, whether it be training or screening or whatever that would have prevented this. But you do get to certain degrees of chaos where you recognize that we are out of our depth and our capacity to contain this based off of just warm fuzzies and the proper education.
Now, Nathan won't tell you this, but I can tell you this. Nathan, the Rittenhouse household does not have a television, and they're not watching John Wick films. But I
That's
think
true.
that's a but I think that's a convicting word from you, Nathan, because you're pointing out that why do we have an appetite for this kind of stuff? I mean, you do look at our entertainment habits, and it's hard to avoid the fact that there's what appears to be quite a persistent bloodlust there. And also, what we think is, I thought something else that was very interesting that you said was that we often take for granted that this is a realistic view of just the way things are,
Or the way we
but
want them to be.
or the way we want them to be. But things don't have to be like that. Even with human nature being what it is, things don't have to be that violent. There are other ways. There are other ways to solve problems, but it's just worth floating that out there. Just how a default setting for us is that, well, of course, just violence is a necessary ingredient in human life
Mhm.
and society. That thought actually has a lot more to do with people like Thomas Hobbes and Locke, who codified this into their political theories, than it actually has to do with the way the way things play out. Yes, human beings are capable of some incredibly wicked and explosive and violent and hateful behavior, but human beings are also capable of incredibly healing and beautiful behavior in the face of major crises. You see this. You can see this time and time again. I mean, amazingly, the way communities come together in the face of shattering attacks and just horrors. But people, it doesn't have to look like this. But here's another pointed question that goes along with what Nathan was saying, and just the general violence in the air, and maybe our own part in it. I want to float out a question, and then I want to play a little thought experiment out, and then hand it over to Nathan. But the question is, I mean, for those of us who operate vehicles and drive, I mean, how many of us have succumbed to road rage? I mean, the the incredible explosive violence that comes out of our mouths sometimes when we're behind the wheel of a car. I mean, it just gives, vindication to, the words of James when he says, all the worries about the tongue, because, we bless our Lord and then we curse our fellow man. And this is something that is just kind of a way of life for many of us. And I do think that there are times where the social, sort of the bonds of human relationships and social mores do get gossamer thin and crumble. And there are so I do think there are cultural moments where you've got more road rage, less restraint, and other times where manners, community standards, I sound very old fashioned here, very old Little House on the Prairie, but do act as sort of forms of restraint. I think we're definitely in a very
Mhm.
unrestrained moment where, and part of that, I mean, there are numerous factors there, that the notion that you should always express yourself, our hyper individualistic behavior, but it absolutely contributes to, we forget, I mean, we inhabit a spiritual world. I mean, we are polluting, in a sense, the world
Mhm.
with our hatred and our profanity, and our invective, and that does create a very real atmosphere. But here's a quick thought experiment for you, and this goes back to, what if one of these five officers was part of a PCA church in your area, or the local Baptist church or something? It's part of your denomination. So, what share of ownership do we take? I think here's just a thought experiment, because this goes to something that we talk about a lot on the podcast, because this is true of many. This we a lot of us fall into this in our Christian thinking. Okay, if you go to a church where there is that bracketing that's kind of stressed, maybe inadvertently, between spiritual life and real life. The spiritual life is your devotions, your prayer, your worship of Jesus. This happens on a Sunday, and it's very important. But then you leave the church and you go back into the real world with real problems that require hard and real solutions, whether they're financial, whether they're legal. And there you consult all the experts and you just live as a normal professional. And so you live your life as though the fear of God, well, you live your life outside of the fear of God, and you live your life as though God isn't really, he's a sort of a distant deistic God, or he's not really, plays no role at all. This is what Craig M. Gay calls practical atheism. So if that is the vision that's being reinforced in your church, then that's a vision that makes it possible for us to bracket the fact that human beings are made in the image of God when we're going to our office. And when we have the ability to crush somebody, we crush somebody. When we have the ability to curse them out when we're driving and cut them off and ride them, and then we do that. And we're able to maintain that neat little division. And sadly, and again, we are for the church. We love the church, but sadly, some of our churches here in North America have ended up inadvertently, I think, reinforcing that kind of a notion. And we need to, as Christian people, vigorously push back against that kind of truncated vision of human life.
So what are we actually saying here? There's a sense in which, oh, this is the case, that there are degrees of chaos that you can't control. And so the only thing that you can control is how you respond to it. Like there are things that are we
Yeah.
intellectually know that can be true, but it's a discipline and a habit to bring that back into reality. So, yeah, you live in Atlanta where traffic is chaotic. I mean, I was
Yeah.
with you once when you got pulled over on the most ridiculous thing. Yeah, we'll get
Well,
into that
thank you.
sometime. Yeah, I would fully justify Cameron's head shaking at that whole entire situation. Um, and I mean, you're totally helpless and defenseless in that, even in court. On yeah, so
Mhm.
you're part of a system where there's no way that you come out on top of that. Now the way that you treated the officer was very different, so that was a big part of how that worked out. But let me say this: so yeah, you live in Atlanta where traffic is crazy, and I can see how things tension builds up there. I live at a place where there's not a lot of traffic. In fact, if I have to stop at a stop sign, we're like, man, what's going on around here? But that means we use our high beams at night to drive a lot, because oftentimes you're the only car on the road. And when a car's coming the other direction, what do you do? 500 feet from the
You're
front, 200 feet from the
Yeah.
back, you put your low beams on, because it's a common courtesy to not to blind the other person. And I get cranked about this, and I complain about it to my wife all the time. We're living in a time of nobody cares about anybody else's experience. Everybody leaves their high beams on. And so I have more opportunity to turn the other cheek when it comes to people leaving their high beams on, because my impulse is I'll just leave my high beams on too. And so every single time that I turn my low beams on and somebody leaves their high beams on, and I have a little car, so I mean, I'm always getting it right in the face. Um, it's like, this is the right thing to do. Like, this is my opportunity to turn the other cheek
Mhm.
and not perpetuate, which I know sounds like a super silly thing when I say it out loud, but yeah, it just points to that. Like, you have to make a conscientious effort, even on the tiny things, to say, I'm not participating in the system of retaliation,
Yeah.
um, even if I could easily justify it in my mind.
And it will feel like a lost cause. And so let's bring in Wendell Berry again. I was reading a lovely little essay of his from the early years on maintaining what he called a marginal farm.
Hmm.
And basically talked about how they've developed the land that they have. They've cultivated it. They've done so not using, major industrial techniques and all of that. But he also made some major mistakes, and there's been some soil erosion and all of that. And he basically says a lot of what I'm doing from a technical standpoint is probably a lost cause. But there's something that helps you keep going. And I'm butchering his elegant language, but at the end, it helps to love farming, is essentially what he says at the end.
Hmm.
And I think that's a picture. I mean, obviously, he means that. He means you to take this more broadly. For Wendell Berry, everything comes down to farming. If you start
Yeah,
to read
pretty
him,
much. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, but so when you are turning the other cheek, when you're doing the hard stuff, when you're loving your enemies, the older you get, the less abstract that becomes, and you start getting real enemies, and you're like, oh gosh, God, do I really have to love these people? Yes. And the more it begins to feel like a lost cause in terms of short-term rewards, there will be very little short-term rewards. In fact, the more you press into the way of Christ, the more difficulty you're going to encounter from a cultural standpoint. What's going to help you as you carry on what appears to be a lost cause, it's not, but it will, in earthly terms, it is kind of. What will help you is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and then to love your neighbor. That's what you have to do. And again, it's going to take discipline. That's why it has to be more than just some mood or a feeling. And you have to train yourself into it. You do not drift into that kind of radical commitment to love. And it looks as
Mhm.
practical as, yeah, not fighting back with your own high beams, but even when somebody blinds you and burns off your own retinas, and not participating in road rage. But also when you see something this horrific and this heinous, recognizing the place of human nature in this case and not shying away from those implications, but also recognizing what can be done in our own spheres of influence, in our own communities, our own churches, our own neighborhoods, and thinking about what are the ways in which I can not only refrain from the chaos, but then also find ways to pour into my community and just to try to help, to try to be a healing presence. Lord, our prayer needs to be for imagination for that. That's what you need,
Yeah.
tremendous creativity from that. And that will come from the Holy Spirit.
Okay. Let me try a conclusion and see if you think this works, because there's a huge danger here. One is to say, oh, we're going to look at this at a broad meta level and forget that a person died. The other one is to just focus on, well, this is a person who died. That's Memphis. That's not where I live. That's over there. And there are two extremes there that we don't want to get stuck in. On the other hand, being a Christian, and I think if I can summarize what I think we've collectively been trying, and we ask for your patience on this. We're really trying to grapple with this, and we'll have inadvertently said things that are perhaps inaccurate, naive, or miscalculated, but it's not ill intentioned. Um, but I think here's kind of the nugget that I'm seeing in the middle of all of this is there's a way as a follower of Christ that we can look at things in the world and say that is wrong. And we don't need a whole lot of other details. We can just look at it and say that is wrong. This is sad and this is bad and that should not have happened. We can clearly and definitively say that, and we have perfect moral grounding and framework for saying that because we believe in the sanctity of human life and basic decency and dignity of all people. That's wrong. On the other hand, following Christ gives us the ability to do that and clarity on that. On the other hand, it doesn't allow it to just stay over there. Jesus often looked at tragedies and said, yeah, that was bad, but what about you? And so there's this both and thing that happens there. To handle this in a Christ-like way is to be able to condemn something, to be able to grieve something, but then also to be able to look at that isn't unique to just over there. That's probably alive. There are elements of that that are alive and well in your own heart too, and where you live in your own communities. And so it becomes a thing that you have to wrestle with introspectively and locally, because even though it didn't happen maybe next door to you, it's still a reminder to you of the reality of humanity. And it's fascinating to me. You talked about as you grow, you get more enemies, how my kids are just becoming aware of evil being a real thing, like experientially. And as they do that, there's a certain amount of trepidation that they sense and fear in the world. But then the resources of the church and the teachings of Christ become more special. And so we've talked a lot about the provision or the command and the prayer that the Lord taught his disciples: deliver us from evil. That's a legitimate thing to ask for and a legitimate thing that the Lord can provide. And so there's a sense in which the gospel begins to make more sense when you see the actual nature of humanity that it was built to engage with, and not a sparkles and glitter and facade of humanity that we like to construct. And so there's something gut wrenching about these things that we see, but it's a shock back into the reality of the way that people are and the need for brokenness to be redeemed, not just in our relationship with God, but also in our relationship with each other, and what that would mean for us to have a stable and civil society. So nobody gets off the hook on not needing to deal and wrestle with this deeply. We can all see things that are bad and call them as such, and then we can all open-heartedly confess our own sin and open-handedly before the Lord say, see if there be any deceitful or wicked way within me, and create in me a clean heart, O God. And so we don't know what the outcome of all of this will be, or even what the whole story is, but I know enough about what God wants of us in response to these things to be able to offer you those words in conclusion. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.